Stay tuned now for Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome, everybody, to Westchester Eye on the Radio. I'm Peter Moses with my co-host Ardina Seward and John Sharan. I'd like to start off, John, by telling you that you and I are two of the four worst players and owners in our rotisserie league baseball.
Yes, and as I mentioned to you, given the fact that there's still 159 games left to play, I'm not panicking yet.
Are you happy?
No, I mean, but I can point to three minor incidents that
with major repercussions.
Well,
yes.
No, that have repercussions here because it's like a horses breaking from the gate. They're all together, so a minor thing can put you back a stride. But similarly, another opportunity can get you up two strides.
And if he gets two or three injuries in the next 2 or 3 weeks, he's going to have a very different tune. I already have some guy who went on disabled list today, Weddle. Anyway, not that anybody cares about that. How are you, Ardina?
Oh, it's, overcoming allergies, but I guess that's not as bad as overcoming fantasy baseball.
Well, you have to have your priorities, Ardina.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to welcome our guest today. Her name is Kathy Kaufman. She was, I don't know the name. Do you represent an organization?
Yeah, I'm a member of the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform.
That's probably fairly self-explanatory what that means. You attended a flash demonstration, as Ardina phrased it in her note to us, in front of the home office for Andrea Stewart Cousins. What was the purpose of the flash demonstration?
Well, our organization and other organizations around the county have been watching a few pieces of legislation that we've been hoping would make it into the budget and become policy for New York State. And as the budget became finalized around April 1st, and the days leading up to April 1st, it became apparent that we really weren't getting strong advocacy out of the senator's office. She's now one of the three men in the room, with air quotes, and we weren't really getting the kind of advocacy we were hoping for. So we decided to send a message to the senator and went out to demonstrate in front of her office for three different forms of three different bills, basically.
What were the three bills?
Sorry about that. Driver's licenses for all, which is a piece of legislation that would allow immigrants to obtain a New York State driver's license, regardless of their documentation status.
I know the mayor of Ossining and the police, the head of the police in Ossining, are both pushing for that.
Yeah,
well.
In fact, there are communities around the county, and to some people's surprise, even the northern part of the county that are advocating and have actually adopted ID laws that allow people to obtain alternative forms of ID. But for a driver's license, it has to be coming through Albany.
And the other two?
End cash bail, to eliminate cash bail so that people of low income are not held in jail pre-trial when they have not yet been convicted because they do not have enough money to pay cash bail to get out before their arraignment. And the third one is ending marijuana legalization, which we approach from a social justice issue and racial justice perspective.
Well, I know we were talking before the show, Ardina was talking about this, is that she was surprised to learn that they did not pass marijuana reform yesterday, and at the same time, they did pass congestion pricing. One of which seemed to have had very widespread support. The other one, the one that passed, did not have widespread support.
And the interesting thing from my perspective,
you got
Peter,
talking to the mic, but
thank you so much. The interesting thing from my perspective, Peter, is the fact that the marijuana situation could be a huge revenue generator for the state. And the state's crying poverty, much more so than it would be with congestion pricing. So to me, it would make more sense for them to consider that.
One penalizes drivers, does nothing about road repair,
right?
Whereas taxes for marijuana could be used for a whole series of social and infrastructure problems that we have. What was your take on it, Kathy? Why do you think it failed?
Well, I think it failed because it sounded like a shoo-in. So first of all, I think because it seemed like a done deal, a lot of people stopped paying attention. So already at the outset, when Cuomo said, we're going to do this, I think a lot of people said, okay, great. And turned off stopped paying attention, basically unplugged from the issue. But what really happened was that following on the experiences of states that have legalized before New York.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're going to be going to break soon, and I thought you may have had a really simple explanation, but apparently that's not.
It sounds rather complicated.
It sounds complicated, and too complicated for 15 or 20 seconds, or 30 seconds. Well, at least we have pretty weather today, which is nice. It should be warmer, but
keep our fingers crossed. Hopefully, the last day that is below 50 degrees.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. Anyway, for all of you listening, this is Westchester Eye on the radio on WVOX, WVOX.com, 1460 on the radio dial, and WVX.com on the computer. And we're going to break. We'll be right back.
Let's return now to Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome back to a weekly discussion of issues relating to Westchester and the surrounding area. I'm John Sharan, along with Peter Moses and Ardina Seward, and our special in-studio guest is Kathy Kaufman, who is a progressive activist, and she was telling us a little bit when she was interrupted, going to go into a little bit of depth and explanation about marijuana reform.
So I think your question was, why didn't it pass?
Right.
And I think the very short answer is that there are the sponsoring legislators who had put together a package to kind of improve upon what Cuomo had originally proposed, weren't able to work out the details in time, and in particular, they were having trouble pulling over, I think, to their side some of the social justice related measures that they'd included in their package, which included. For instance, there are anticipated anything from $300 million to $800 million in revenue from the bill, and there is a fair amount of disagreement, I think, on how much of that will be going back into communities that were most impacted by racial disparities in marijuana enforcement. And then there are other issues with growing your own marijuana, with licensing, and I think what they really wanted to do is do it right, and that couldn't be done in the budget.
Yeah, I had read that some of the black lawmakers, African American lawmakers, and Latino lawmakers were holding out for a promise that African Americans and Latinos would be granted licenses, because there was an issue with the cost of the license for growing marijuana that seemed prohibitive for low-income communities, which, to your point, are most impacted by the present marijuana law.
Yeah, it wouldn't be that they'd be given licenses, but that the barriers to entry would be lowered generally.
Yeah.
And that the industry would be structured in such a way that it wouldn't only be accessible to large commercial entities that already had huge infrastructure investments in legal marijuana in other states that already legalized. So the idea is, it's really the difference between saying, oh, well, yeah, we'll have another big pharma or big tobacco or big liquor industry here, and giving the industry to people who are already well capitalized, versus making it an industry that's much more accessible. And those are things that can be structured by regulation, but that has to be hammered out point by point.
Where do we stand now in terms of how the lobbying and the potential law is being sculpted, and when would the next vote be? How far away are we from seeing legalization?
Well, So at this point, it'll be through the legislative process that's going to go on now through June. Toward June, there's just usually an enormous sort of convulsion of legislation that gets passed. And that is more difficult because it's hammered out in the light of day. So all those legislators, the senators and assembly people have to stick their necks out and place a vote as opposed to slipping things through the budget. But most likely, if it's going to happen, it will happen this is when we're expecting it to happen, is before June.
But then legislators walk a fine line when they're trying to curry favor with police unions, because to be backed, if you're a lawmaker and you are backed by the police union, that's a huge voting block, and most of the police unions oppose legalizing marijuana. So where does that put legislators on both sides of the aisle?
Yeah, that was a pretty big disappointment to me. I'm not an advocate of marijuana consumption, but I am an advocate of marijuana legalization because I do think that having an enormous black market operating in our communities is a lose-lose. So I was pretty disappointed when the police unions, including in policing organizations like the Westchester Police Chiefs Association, came out and said, "Oh, this is." We're very emphatically against legalization. I thought that was a mistake because it really disregards the risks that are built into having a black market for communities and individuals. So I think that what has happened is that this sort of pause button that we're in now, this pause period, will give us a chance to have these conversations and reconsider some of the arguments that different groups have been making.
But might it also galvanize the opposition? I mean, you have a lot of upstate communities and upstate members of the state legislature who are very much opposed to it. And if they're working with these police departments and these police departments are opposing it, isn't it possible that lobby might grow larger?
Well, there are upstate communities that are opposed, and there are upstate communities that are actually very pro-legalization. So,
like what? Like which upstate communities are pro?
Well, we have a very, large contingent of legalization advocates in Rochester. The current legislation is being, is being co-championed by a Rochester legislator. So, I think that I think it's a little bit facile to say that there's a geographic divide around this. I think that
New York State there's a geographical divide in not that what's the word you use? Divide in much of what goes on in state politics.
I agree, but marijuana is in widespread use across the entire state, and there is not a lot of geographic variation in the extent of use. So you have 1.6 million New Yorkers who said they used marijuana in the past month in the last large national survey. And that's true across the geographies of the state. There's not a lot of variation. So what that means is that all of those people are using unregulated drugs of unknown potency to a great extent. And so that safety risk is out there for people across the state, regardless of where they live. And I think that's something that's understood. The marijuana legalization polls at about over 60% approval rate across. Sorry, did I say that right? Positive marijuana, people who are pro marijuana legalization, about 60% are pro across the state. In the New York suburbs, it's slightly lower. It's 56 to 59% as of last week. Approval. So I'm not sure about the geography in this case.
Well, we'll have more discussion about that and other issues. We're speaking with Kathy Kaufman, a progressive activist here in Westchester, and you're listening to Westchester Eye on the radio, our weekly discussion of issues relating to Westchester and the surrounding area. I'm John Charan, along with Peter Moses and Ardina Seward, and we'll be back after a brief Fox News break.
Let's return now to Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
And you are listening to Westchester Eye on the Radio. That's WVOX, 1460 AM. Also streamed online at WVOX.com. And today, our guest is Kathy Kaufman. And Kathy is a part of police reform.
Westchester Coalition for Police Reform.
Westchester Coalition for Police Reform. And we are talking about the failure of the marijuana reform law to pass. We are talking about congestion pricing.
We're not talking about
But isn't police reform distinct from that? I mean, maybe Kathy can tell us a little bit about what she'd like to see reformed.
And how the police figure in that.
That would be good.
Well, I can tell you a little bit about Westchester Coalition for Police Reform, which is an interesting organization. They were founded in the wake of the killing of Kenneth Chamberlain Sr. 6 years ago in White Plains, an elderly veteran who had accidentally triggered his medical alert device, and was summoned the police. And eventually, after an escalating altercation with the police in which he didn't want to open his door, he was shot and killed by 2 White Plains police officers.
In some ways, it was similar to Eleanor Bumpers.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
It was.
So our organization is actually looking to try to create public safety by improving police-community relations across the whole county in every community. And actually, we're right now launching an interesting project. We are about to launch on April 25th. We're having a kickoff meeting for a voter guide project. And what we'd like to do is to engage communities all across the county, from the smallest village to the largest municipality, and in asking their candidates a series of key questions about where they stand on criminal justice issues. So we're going to be going out, we're reaching out to organizations, trying to find community partners and organizations across the county to hear what their concerns are, and we'll coalesce around a few issues, and we'll begin to talk to candidates, hopefully put together our first guide before the November elections.
How many people belong to your organization?
I don't know. I think we have a membership list that's pretty substantial. Maybe I actually don't know exactly, but perhaps 100 people. We have about a couple dozen very active members, as many organizations do, and then other people who come in and out. We regularly host events that have attendance, over 60.
And are you the chairperson for this?
No, I'm not.
There was a program that a young Yonkers resident started. His name is Hector Santiago. It was called the Stop and Shake. It was to foster better community relations between Yonkers citizens and the Yonkers police force. And basically the gist of it was, when you see an officer on the street, stop and shake his hand and tell him that you appreciate him. And it seemed to put a little balm, that's BALM, on the wounds of Yonkers residents with the Yonkers Police Department, which historically had a rather adversarial role, but they're doing a great job now. And I wonder how that's working in other communities. Other communities do not have the Stop and Shake program, but is there any kind of community activism to foster a better relationship between the residents and the police?
Well, there are, many communities will have these coffee with the cop kinds of events, but I think our organization is looking a little bit more at structural issues, like improving the data that comes out of police departments so that we can understand better, and that citizens can understand better where crimes occur, and how fundamentally how their police departments are operating. We're also very interested in policies that govern how police officers interact with communities, whether they're obligated to identify themselves in the case of a police stop, or tell a person the rationale for the stop. Those kinds of policies are things that we think will hopefully, as they're adjusted, will improve people's trust in police, and improve relationships with police officers.
I think one of my questions about that would be, when you have a community like Mount Vernon, which is a city that has great tumult at the top of city government. They have a mayor who at some point is going to have to fight for his freedom in court, and his police department is in turmoil because people are leaving in droves. Top people are being pushed out, and who's going? I mean, in a city of that size, with crime issues the way they have them in Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon has a fair amount of serious crime. There's no respect between the police and the citizenry. And that's not just the people who are committing crimes. People in Mount Vernon who live in the good neighborhoods are just as nervous about the police department as people who live in public housing. How do you reconcile something like that? To me, that seems like an impossible task in a place like Mount Vernon.
I think I can't speak to. I know Mount Vernon is going through a lot, and I can't really speak to it. I can say that, generally speaking, communities all across the country, and not just in Westchester, but including Westchester, are looking for more input and either civilian control or oversight or input into their law enforcement institutions. Who's being appointed? What's their philosophy? How do they view the role of police? How do they view the role of public input? And I think Mount Vernon's no different in the sense that this is a community that's looking to sort of assert some public control and oversight over its institutions.
I don't read exhaustively on Mount Vernon, but that sounds completely in contrast to the things I've read. They seem to be completely out of control over there. They don't seem to have any sort of a mindset of how to deal with any of their problems, which is why so many of them are in court, and why the city government doesn't work, and why the police department has at its top people who really don't seem to have their hands on the pulse of the people in Mount Vernon. There's a lot of problems in places like that.
I'd suggest you have Damon Jones in to talk about Mount Vernon, because he is the one who really has he's the one who really does have his finger on the pulse of what's going on in Mount Vernon. He's also was the former president of Blacks in Law Enforcement for Westchester County, and he is a former corrections officer.
Well, I think that pretty much the Mount Vernon Police Department may be overwhelmed too. I mean, these guys and girls are understaffed, and in proportion to the crime, they're not being funded properly. They just don't have the manpower needed. My point exactly. And the problem with them getting the manpower, to Peter's point, is that there appears to be a controller that has a stranglehold on how the funds are dispersed. So the crime just runs rampant, the cops are frustrated, and the criminals, it's like, hey, just another day. So hopefully that will be rectified at some point, but it doesn't look like it's fast coming on the horizon. But
doesn't mean in other places that it's not. I mean, Ardina spoke well of efforts in Yonkers.
Yonkers has changed. Let me tell you, Yonkers has changed tremendously. I would say Yonkers has done a 180 reversal of past police practices. You know, there are always going to be those who are going to say, well, you know, the cops this, the cops that. But those men and women are doing a fantastic, fantastic job. And we will talk more about police reform because we're coming up on another break. Our guest is Kathy Kaufman, who is a part of the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform. You are listening to WVOX 1460 AM. Stream live on WVOX.com. And if you want to call or comment, 914-636-0110. Don't be shy, but don't turn it into a monologue either. So stay with us. Come back for our final 15 minutes on Westchester Eye on the Radio.
Let's return now to Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome back to the final quarter hour here at Westchester Eye on the Radio. I'm John Sharan along with Peter Moses and Ardina Seward. And in studio today we have Kathy Kaufman, a progressive activist who's been talking about police reform here in Westchester. And Kathy, you're involved with a lot of reform issues. How did you get started with them?
Well, that's a good question. I lived in Irvington for about 25 years and basically started to feel like there were issues out there that were impacting communities outside of my own that we could do a better job addressing.
About how long ago was that?
About 2 years ago.
Oh, really? So
Yeah.
you're a newcomer to this activist
I actually
stage.
am.
Okay.
I actually am.
Do you know, if you live in Irvington 25 years, you must know a mutual friend, Ardina, and I have a guy whose first name is Storm.
I've
Elliot Feldstein?
Yep, he's my former neighbor. We used to live on the same street, but we Irvingtonians, we move around a lot, so I ended up moving to the next block. But yeah, good guy.
Yes.
So
He's
anyway.
kind of a weird guy, but yeah, he's good.
But go ahead, finish your point.
So for me, I basically came to the realization that there were people who were being policed very differently from the way I was being policed. So if I got pulled over for a broken headlight, people would just say, "Oh, Mrs. Kaufman," even though I'm not Mrs. Kaufman. "Oh, Mrs. Kaufman, it's okay. Just go take care of that." And that wasn't happening for a lot of other people in a lot of other communities. And that really, really bothered me. So the marijuana issue is new for me. Actually, I'm a sociologist and I do research and data analysis for a living. And I was approached by an organization called Drug Policy Alliance, and they said, "Hey, would you analyze the data on low-level marijuana possession arrests for us in Westchester County over the past 20 years and write a report?" And I said, "Sure." And that was about 9 months ago. And I had no position on marijuana legalization at the time. And I started looking at the data, and the data was really interesting for me because it was very granular. I could look at marijuana possession arrests. The data only had records on the very most minor form of possession, marijuana possession in the 5th degree, which is just having less than 28 grams of marijuana on your person.
And how far back did this study go, and how far back did the data go also in terms of the body of people who were involved?
We've basically focused, I kept data going back for 20 years, but I basically looked at the last 5 years and looked at racial differences, age differences, gender differences in marijuana possession arrests. And what we found was pretty surprising. It was pretty dramatic.
Well, don't keep it a surprise. Tell us what it said.
Well, in a nutshell, Westchester County is an epicenter for marijuana possession arrests. It's the outside of New York City, it has the third most marijuana possession arrests in the state on a county basis. It has 16% of all of the state's marijuana possession arrests outside of the city, despite the fact that it only has 8% of the population of the state. And then what was very interesting is that across every city and town and village, there were very dramatic racial disparities. So Black people are arrested at 15 times the rate of white people across Westchester County. And for low-level marijuana possession, despite the fact that there are no statistically significant racial differences in the use of marijuana across different racial and ethnic groups. And Latino people are arrested at 5 times the rate of whites. So, and that is true whether you look at a tiny village, whether you look in North County, South County. It's true in every single municipality in the county. There are differences in the extent of the disparities, but the disparities are there and pretty noticeable everywhere.
That would mirror what goes on around this country in every crime category.
Well, the reason that it's different...
Oh, I don't know if you're going to say stock swindling would be that way.
No.
No, what
Most
makes it
street
different
crime.
is that it's not, in terms of marijuana, it's unique in the sense that you can't say that it's a reflection of differences in the level of the likelihood of committing that crime, because we actually have very, very good statistics on the prevalence of use. So anything else, people will say, oh, well, this ethnic group or that ethnic group is more likely to commit that crime. But you can't actually say that for marijuana because we have underlying data on that.
Have you found an increase, or over time, have you found it either to increase or decrease the number of arrests?
There have been changes over time, but there are also population size changes.
Okay.
So I don't think that that's a focus for me, because we really need to, that's why we tend to focus on rates, the likelihood of being arrested.
Have the rates stayed the same or close to it?
You know what? I actually can't answer that right off the top of my head. I can't. But I would like to send people to the report, if you don't mind, because that gives them a chance to look up their hometown and see how their hometown's doing. And those are ranked, and that's kind of fun and interesting to look at.
And where on the World Wide Web might somebody find this?
Google Westchester Marijuana Arrests Report, and it's the first thing that comes up. Or you can look at drugpolicy.org, which is the Drug Policy Alliance website. But I just suggest Westchester Marijuana Arrests Report.
Keep it simple, and it'll pop up.
It will pop up.
Okay.
And then you can look up your town.
That statistic of blacks and Latinos being arrested at a higher rate than whites. Is there a way to determine what percentage of that 15% and 5% were dealers? Were drug dealers? Because there's a big difference between a guy who's got, like a 3-ounce bag, as opposed to a white guy just coming home from Wall Street and he's got 2 joints on him.
Yeah, these are only low-level marijuana possession arrests. So these are people who actually had an amount that's legal to carry with you if it's not in public view or burning, but it was taken out of public view or found to be burning. So these tend to be people who were subject to a search because they were pulled over for a speeding ticket, or ostensibly because the officer smelled marijuana. These are only people who have 5th degree. The top charge in their arrest was a 5th degree possession arrest, which is the smallest quantity of marijuana that's actually legal to possess under the decriminalization rules, unless it's out or burning. So often you'll have someone in an encounter with an officer and they say, please empty your bag, or show me what's in your pockets. When somebody pulls that out, a joint out, now it's in public view, now it's not legal.
But I just want to pursue that point a little more, because again, is there a way to determine that within that 50% and 5% respectively, how many of those people had previous arrests? How many of them?
Remember, it's not 15%. They're 15 times more likely than white people.
50 times more likely. So
there's no way to know, except that I doubt a drug dealer would be facing a 5th degree possession charge, because that is not selling. It's only possessing. And it's 28 grams, which is about 1 joint, maybe 2 joints.
So most dealers would be having more, Ardina.
And they'd be selling. It's not a sale. This is just possession.
But again, I'm trying to put myself into the place of a cop. A cop pulls a guy over whose name is Johnny Smith or whatever. He catches him with a couple of joints, and then he goes through Johnny Smith's record, and he figures, you have a big rap sheet. So would that presence of that individual's rap sheet predispose the cop to arresting Johnny Smith?
I can't speak to what goes on in the minds of cops.
Well, I also think it depends where this is taking place. I mean, if this takes place in, like, say, the neighborhoods that you and I covered in the Bronx, in all probability, they're not going to get an arrest. The cops don't want to bother. If this happens in Bronxville, it's a different situation.
It's a different story, sure.
It's a different story depending on the community. If this happens in Portchester, the cops are going to laugh and say, just get out of here. It happens in Rye, it's a different... Well, if it's a rich kid...
There are tens of thousands of arrests that happen in the major municipalities in Westchester County. Yonkers, Mount Vernon, White Plains, and New York City had, an absolute avalanche of arrests. So
we're going to have to end our conversation because we're getting near the end of our day. Thank you very much for coming in. We appreciate it. I just want to briefly talk about our show next week. Next week, this won't be in your bailiwick so much, but you can look it up if you like. That's a phrase that Casey Stengel used. You could look it up. We're going to have Wayne Coffey, who is a Daily News reporter, investigative reporter, for probably 25, 27 years. And he wrote a book called They Said It. It's a very long title. They Said It Couldn't Be Done. The 69 Mets, New York City, and the most astounding season in baseball history. He will be on next week. I disagree that it was the most astounding season in baseball history. I think 1951 was the most astounding season in New York in baseball history, with the Dodgers and Giants tying on the last day of the season, and then Bobby Thompson giving the good guys, the Giants, the pennant, and the bad guys,
and a lot
the
of people
Dodgers,
don't
went
know
home.
that was in the third game of a playoff series.
Right. It was. So Wayne will have some anecdotal stories for us. He interviewed all of the prime players of that team. Couldn't interview the manager, Gil Hodges. He died in 1972 at the age of 47. Anyway, everybody, have a great week, and hopefully it gets warmer.